All right, well, folks, here we are, the last video of the year. Of course, in the last video for Chapter 32, The Age of Globalization. Again, the things here are stuff we've all lived through, are fairly contemporary. Well, not fairly contemporary, very contemporary. So the historical ramifications, again, of this stuff has really yet to be seen. Uh, you know, things that over time may become significant 20 years from now when I'm teaching this class, if I am. Uh, you know, they will be more historical, certainly in nature, uh, but nonetheless, things important enough to at least touch on a little bit now. So we'll go right into it, and as always, I'm gonna do my best to try to keep this one a little bit shorter and finish things off. So. One of the big, of course, things that really come to the forefront in the 21st century uh, are ethical and moral standards for people, especially during the first couple decades, first decade and a half or so, really, of the 21st century, where um, questions of ethical ideals and moral ideals really come into play. Some of this is brought about by this family values, traditional values society that's brought on during that new kind of conservatism movement, spearheaded really during Reagan's presidency. Um, but they take kind of shape with more modern issues. One of the things that's always kind of at the forefront has to do with genetics and breakthroughs with genetics. And, the persistent question when it comes to this, um, which is, how much, should we really mess with, in other words, God's intentions. Things that have happened over the last couple decades, such as, uh, you know, successful cloning of a sheep, uh, advances in genetics research, the Human Genome Project, and things like that, have certainly been great scientific breakthroughs, but at the same time, have raised a lot of concerns, particularly from Christian groups and evangelicals. Um, One form of genetics breakthrough, though, that certainly has been beneficial is the advancing uh, reliability of DNA testing, which has gone a long way in um, proving criminal activity through blood testing, through semen samples and things like that in cases of rape and other violence, um, which obviously has been very beneficial for law enforcement. Uh, you know, Very beneficial in the case of cold cases that have been gone unsolved for a long time. One example, recent example, was the Golden State serial killer who was active in like the late 70s through the mid to late 1980s, who had committed all these murders throughout the state of California, during that time, and had gone kind of unsolved, for a couple decades until I think it was like 2018 that that DNA testing confirmed the identity of the person who did it, and they were able to bring that man whose name I can't think of offhand to justice. So there is a lot of benefits that have come through some of the genetics breakthroughs we've made that have been beneficial for DNA testing, especially in regards to crime. Another ethical, and then not so much an ethical issue, but um, one that has always been at the forefront, especially in the 80s and 90s, was the AIDS epidemic. Now, when AIDS first came about in the 1980s, um, it was a major, major concern. Fortunately, by today, there's a lot of drugs and medicines that can be taken to slow the process of what AIDS does to the body. Back in the 1980s, when it first came about, it was a terrifying disease. There was news every day on the news every day about AIDS and the latest breakthroughs in medical treatments and number of people getting it, and public service announcements and commercials about safe sex or preventing contraction of the AIDS virus. AIDS was scarier than cancer. And I don't say that lightly. Cancer probably is the scariest disease out there. But in the 1980s and into the 90s, AIDS was absolutely a death sentence. I remember when Magic Johnson got AIDS, and as a kid at that time, I was terrified. He was my favorite athlete growing up, and I was devastated that, that had happened. And the belief was, he's dead. He'll be gone and dead within a couple of years because of how bad the AIDS epidemic was. In terms of coverage and social awareness and concern, I'd put it right up there with coronavirus. Now, obviously, or COVID-19. Now, obviously, AIDS is a lot more dangerous and deadly than COVID, but in terms of how aware people were of it, very much so. In the late 1990s, we started coming up with much better treatments for AIDS, and it has made the disease much more manageable. One thing to understand about AIDS, people don't actually die from AIDS, but what the HIV virus or what becomes AIDS does is it basically destroys people's immune systems, which makes their bodies much more susceptible to other illnesses, where things like a bout with pneumonia can be fatal. A bad flu could be fatal, and obviously cancers could be extremely debilitating for somebody that's also HIV positive. But lots of awareness came about, lots of research into the AIDS virus in the 1990s, and the epidemic of AIDS has managed to kind of be dissipated a little bit. The other, of course, persistent debate has been regarding abortion. In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was passed, obviously this upset particularly Catholics and a large base of people, with very passionate views on abortion. By the 1990s, this really kind of morphed into this growing right to life movement, largely spurned because the administration of Clinton, the Clinton administration was a pro-choice administration, which gave kind of passion and life to the right to life movement to kind of counteract the pro-choice movement, which many kind of mistakenly associate with being a pro-abortion movement. You got to be careful about that. Regardless of what you feel about that, as Catholics, of course, we support life and believe, that life begins with conception. But to label the pro-choice movement a pro-abortion movement, the language and wording of that certainly makes it a little bit controversial. But in any event, you have a lot of people in America that believe, obviously, in life, and you have a lot of people in America that believe in a woman's right to choose. So that, of course, has created a lot of moral question and ethical question, and is a large determining factor for a lot of people when they go and vote. So certainly the long-term implications of that are very important. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so in 2008, Barack Obama gets elected president, and it's important to really, whether or not you like President Obama or supported President Obama, it's important to recognize the social importance of the ascension of an African American to the White House. It is as I put in the notes that I handed you, it's the culmination of many of the efforts of the civil rights movement, with the efforts made by Martin Luther King Jr. and others to pursue rights for African Americans, with the dream, that Martin Luther King talked about, in his speech in Washington in 1963. So, uh, again, without thinking about the politics of Obama, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you can't underscore the significance of, again, the election of an African American to the White House in this country and the long-term importance of that. Now, I remember, on that election day, that watching the results coming in, because I lived in Washington D.C. at that time, and now I didn't vote for Obama, but when it was determined that evening, that night, that he had indeed won the election, I really did for a minute just sit back and think and said, wow, how far our country had come in regards to race, to the point where which was made evident that night, that our country was ready to elect a black man president of the United States. So the social importance there is certainly something worthy of recognition. Now, Obama's presidency itself is one that ultimately kind of results in a bit of a mixed bag for a lot of people. The most persistent debate that has been created regarding Obama's presidency, of course, has been Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. The goal of the Affordable Care Act, of course, is to be able to make health care plans more affordable to a larger portion of the population. That aspect of the program was quite successful. Within the first couple of years of its implementation, something like 24 more million Americans had health care. Opponents of the Affordable Care Act cite other issues, such as kind of the taking away of people's individual rights in choosing their healthcare systems, which is somewhat limited by the policies included in Obamacare, which is a massively huge piece of legislation. Legislating, like forcing people to take health care, essentially, is kind of, in the view of some, a restriction of people's rights. And that, of course, creates a lot of the tension surrounding Obamacare. Other opponents of Obamacare say because healthcare now is being provided for people with a lot less income, that makes healthcare costs rise and more expensive for those that can't afford to pay. And is that fair for those people? And then, of course, there's those that oppose it simply because, because of the political ideological difference. It's a liberal policy, and they're conservatives, so therefore they don't support or like the plan. The long-term impact of Obamacare, the long-term impact of Obama's election, we won't see and we won't fully understand, maybe for another 10 plus years. So obviously, Affordable Care Act has created persistent debate. One of the other legacies, not really legacies of the Obama presidency, but something that seemed to have an increase of happening over the last decade or so, has been the preponderance of mass shootings that seem to go on in many places around the country. And now in the last few months, we've seen, as COVID restrictions have kind of lessened, we see a kind of an uptick in mass shootings around the country. Contemporarily, we can't fully put our arms around it and understand it. Again, it's another one of those things where retrospectively, where hopefully tragedies like what happened in Las Vegas, at the Mandalay Bay or Sandy Hook or Parkland or any of these other school shootings, the one at the FedEx last week in Indianapolis. Hopefully, when these shootings kind of stop happening, God willing they do, and we're able to kind of think about them in the rear view and look at them in the past and put them in perspective, maybe we'll have a better understanding of why this happened and what factors in society caused this growth in mass shootings. Just like we can look back at the 1970s now that it's been 40 to 50 years, and kind of have more of an understanding why there was this strange increase in cult activity and serial killers during the 1970s. Hopefully, in the coming decades, we'll better understand the reasoning for all these mass shootings. One of the other things we see during the Obama presidency is consistent economic growth. People would argue this, but the reality is, beginning in 2009, we started to pull out of the Great Recession that started in 2007. From that point forward, our economy continually grew and picked up speed as time went on. And this economic growth continued, really starting in 2009 and continuing really until about a year ago when Corona hit, and we had our first downturn in quite some time. So despite having fairly liberal policies as president, for the most part, the presidency of Obama presided over a period of consistent economic growth, which is good for everybody involved. Okay. Again, here's the 2008 election. So you see, the swing states, many of them going for Obama. Florida, Ohio, Indiana, even, which are states typically, at least in the last couple of elections, that have gone. North Carolina, that have gone for Trump or Republicans. So showing a bit of a shift in the way things were in 2008 versus today. All right, and now there's going to be the last slide of the year. Again, 2016 obviously is a very contentious election. The book talks about the election of 1988, Michael Dukakis versus George H.W. Bush, as the most negative election of modern times or the 20th century. Well, the book was written before the election of 2016, which of course was filled with a lot of vitriol, with a lot of negative attacks on both sides. Trump towards Clinton and Clinton towards Trump. But in the end, in a close election, Donald Trump was elected president, as we know. He losing the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College by a noteworthy margin, 306 to 232, I think was the total. Over the last 4 years, our political landscape has become increasingly divided, increasingly divisive. You've got this rhetoric that comes from each side politically, where it seems there's no middle ground where both sides are able to work. I told you a couple videos ago how one of the successes of Bill Clinton as president was his ability to work with folks on both sides of the political aisle. That, for the time being, seems fairly non-existent. Trump, kind of reimagines the Republican Party a little bit in 2008, and despite rhetoric that's often inflammatory, managed to do so with limited opposition from Republican leaders, even ones that he's openly critical of, still defend him and his ideas and policies and stuff like that, which leads to a very divided political world, right? I mean, I tell you this now, and I'm being very careful in how I phrase things because, we tend to look things at one way or the other. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the big problems is the difficulty in the media that we seek out. Now, I talked in the last video a little bit about the role of social media and how we have to be very careful in the social media sources we look at to see what we can actually trust and believe in versus and then you look at like regular news rolls. One thing that's very hard to find today in the news is truth. We tend to seek out the news outlets that believe the things we believe. So what we really essentially do is simply reinforce the things we already believe, and we can't stomach the ideas that come from the sources on the other side, right? So in other words, if you watch Fox News, you can't stand to watch CNN or MSNBC, and of course, vice versa would be true, which makes it very difficult for us to really effectively seek out information that is unbiased, that is going to tell us, kind of the truth of the matter, right? Because you're not going to find the truth on Fox News. You're going to find it on MSNBC. You're not going to find it on CNN. So in order to find truth, you got to take a little bit from both and put it together, and trim away all the stuff that doesn't trim away all the stuff that's not important or irrelevant, and then try to build an understanding off of that. And that's becoming increasingly hard, like I said before, an increasingly divided political landscape. So, obviously, Trump's presidency is filled with a significant amount of controversy. The two impeachments for the Russia investigation, which obviously he denied and continuously denied, and the second impeachment at the end of his presidency for inciting the attack on the Capitol. But the thing that really hurts the Trump presidency more than anything else is, of course, the coronavirus pandemic and the controversial response by the Trump administration to the pandemic, which in many ways didn't go particularly well because, the messaging was mixed, and so on and so forth. One of, and again, that's something that elicits a significant amount of debate. Now, whoever would have been president at the time the pandemic hit, certainly would have faced an uphill battle and would have faced a lot of similar challenges of Trump. Now, this is another one of those things where the microscope and the lens of the presidency of Donald Trump is not going to be fully understood for many years, probably until long after, he's passed away, being a guy in his 70s. So what does it mean for us now? We really don't know yet. This isn't something you're going to see on your AP exam. It's one of those things where we're still, gathering information and we're looking at it. And years from now, we'll look back at it and say, what is the legacy of this? What does it mean? What was, despite all the media biases, the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump stuff, what was the truth and the reality of this period in our country's history? So that is something, of course, that we won't understand for quite some time. And the same goes for the January 6th riot. Now, obviously, the long-term historical ramifications of this, we don't yet know. To me, it rang true of kind of the bonus army and other attempts in our country's history to protest, where people brought their protests to the Capitol, to Washington, D.C. Now the results certainly this time were different. You know, the protesters, you know, broke through into our nation's capital, into the Capitol building, and were destructive. And there was violence, and sadly, you know, a few people were killed. But you know, again, what is the long-term importance of this going to be? When will we fully kind of understand it or wrap our heads around it? You know, we don't know the answers to those questions yet. So again, all this stuff here isn't going to be on your AP exam, but you know, I felt compelled to kind of tie everything off for this year. You know, with you know, kind of hitting on the more recent things as well. So anyway, that's a wrap. It's your last video, so sounds good, and I'll see you guys next time tomorrow.